They were still pouring the champagne when Michelle Felix realized she had married a ghost. The wedding breakfast stretched before her in Sterling Park's grand dining hall, a performance of normalcy where every guest pretended not to notice the chasm between bride and groom. Matthew George, Duke of Warwick, sat 3 feet from her at the head table, his emerald eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the mullioned windows. In 2 hours of celebration, he had not once looked at her. Not once spoken to her. When the toasts came, he raised his glass to the Duchess with the warmth one might reserve for discussing agricultural yields. Michelle's fingers trembled against the stem of her champagne flute. The bubbles rose and burst, the only sound that seemed real in this tableau of elegant pretense. She had known the terms. Her father had explained them with desperate clarity the night he revealed the scandal that would ruin them. The Duke needed an heir and a wife above reproach. She needed a name that could bury the whispers about her brother's gambling debts and her cousin's indiscretion. A transaction. Nothing more. But knowing and living were different countries entirely. Your Grace. She spoke quietly, testing whether he might acknowledge her in this supposedly joyous moment. The gardens here are quiet. The Duchess may explore the grounds at her leisure. His voice cut across hers with surgical precision, addressing the room rather than the woman beside him. I have business in the study. The guest shifted uncomfortably. Lady Pemberton's fan snapped open with unnecessary force. Michelle felt 200 eyes cataloguing her humiliation, measuring the distance between husband and wife, calculating how long this particular Duchess might last in the frozen halls of Sterling Park. She set down her glass with deliberate care. The crystal made no sound against the damask cloth. She had learned long ago how to move through the world without disturbing it, how to make herself small enough to avoid notice. That skill, she realized with bitter clarity, had prepared her perfectly for this marriage. Of course, Your Grace. Her words emerged steady, each syllable a small act of survival. I shall acquaint myself with my new home. Matthew stood without ceremony, nodded to the assembly with ducal formality, and strode from the hall. His footsteps echoed on the marble until even that sound abandoned her. The whispers began before he'd cleared the doorway. Before we continue, if this story has already drawn you in, I invite you to support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. It allows these quiet Victorian tales to reach others who value depth and timeless storytelling. And if you're willing, do leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. It is always a pleasure to see how far these stories travel. Matthew George had not always been silent. The servants at Sterling Park, those who had served long enough to remember, spoke in hushed tones of the boy who once filled these halls with laughter. That child had vanished 12 years ago, the night Lady Elizabeth, his cousin, his confidant, the sister of his heart, wed his half-brother in a match orchestrated to steal Matthew's inheritance. The betrayal had been surgical. Elizabeth had traded letters with Matthew for months, professing devotion, while secretly planning to seize his title through marriage to the one man who could contest it. The courts had eventually ruled in Matthew's favor. His half-brother had fled to the continent. Elizabeth had died in childbirth the following winter, her infant son with her. But Matthew had learned a lesson carved in bone: names were weapons. Affection was ammunition. To speak someone's name with tenderness was to hand them the knife they would eventually place between your ribs. So when he married Michelle Felix, he simply didn't. Not during the ceremony, where he had referred to her only as this woman in his vows. Not during the signing of the register, where he had written her name without once saying it aloud. Not during the wedding breakfast, where she had become the Duchess to his Your Grace, two titles occupying the same room with no bridge between them. Michelle stood now in the doorway of his study, the one room she had been explicitly forbidden to enter, staring at the portrait above the mantelpiece. A young woman with dark curls and laughing eyes gazed back at her, the nameplate reading simply, Elizabeth. Lost but not forgotten. You were told this room was private, madam. She turned to find Matthew silhouetted in the doorway, backlit by the corridor's lamplight. Even in anger, he was beautiful in the way of Gothic ruins, all sharp edges and shadows, elegant decay barely contained. I wanted to understand, Michelle said, gesturing to the portrait. I wanted to know why you cannot bear to say my name. Cannot. His laugh was bitter, a sound like breaking glass. I choose not to, Duchess. There is a difference. Is there? She met his gaze, refusing to look away even as her pulse hammered in her throat. Because from where I stand, it looks remarkably like cowardice. The words hung between them, dangerous and true. For a moment, Michelle thought he might actually see her, not the convenient wife, not the necessary Duchess, but Michelle Felix, the woman who had agreed to live as a ghost in order to save her family from ruin. Instead, Matthew's expression shuttered like a window slamming closed against winter. You will have your own chambers prepared. We will maintain separate households within this estate. When the time comes for marital duties, I will send word. Until then, you are free to occupy yourself however you see fit. Good evening, madam. He turned to leave, and Michelle realized with sudden, piercing clarity that this was her life now, a beautiful prison where she would be fed and clothed and protected and never, ever known. Matthew? Do not. He froze, his back rigid. Do not speak my Christian name. You have not earned that privilege. And how, she whispered, does one earn the privilege of being seen by one's own husband? He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. If I knew, Duchess, perhaps Elizabeth would still be alive. Then he was gone, leaving Michelle alone with a dead woman's portrait and the beginning understanding that she had not married a ghost at all. She had married a man so afraid of haunting that he had buried himself alive. Matthew summoned her to the library 3 days after the wedding, as though she were a tenant come to negotiate terms. Michelle found him at his desk, ledgers spread before him like battle plans, his cravat perfectly tied despite the early hour. Sit. He gestured to the chair opposite without looking up. She remained standing. That earned her a glance, brief, assessing, quickly withdrawn. He closed the ledger with deliberate precision and folded his hands atop it. The arrangement is simple, Duchess. I provide the protection of my name and the security of this estate. Your family's debts are settled. Your reputation is beyond reproach. In return, you will provide an heir and maintain absolute discretion regarding the nature of our union. The nature being that it is not truly a union at all. Precisely. His emerald eyes were glacial in the morning light. "You will have your own household account, your own staff, freedom to pursue whatever occupation suits you. I ask only that you appear beside me at necessary social functions and that when the time comes, you fulfill your primary obligation." Michelle's fingers curled into her skirts. "You speak of a child as though discussing livestock breeding." "I speak of reality, madam. We both know what this is." He stood, signaling the audience was concluded. "I trust these terms are acceptable." She thought of her father's desperate face, her mother's tears, the creditors circling like vultures. "Perfectly acceptable, Your Grace." The lie tasted like ash. Sterling Park devoured sound. Michelle discovered this on her fourth morning as Duchess, wandering corridors that stretched like stone arteries through the estate's ancient body. Her footsteps whispered against marble, swallowed byness before they could echo. Even her breathing seemed intrusive in these halls where centuries of Georges had lived and died and left nothing but portraits with judging eyes. The East Wing housed Matthew's apartments. She knew because Mrs. Havering, the housekeeper, had gestured toward it with the same tone one might use to indicate a cliff edge, informative, cautionary, final. The West Wing was hers, 12 rooms of exquisite loneliness, furnished in blue silk and cream damask that no one would ever see but her. Between them stretched the public rooms, the ballroom where no balls were held, the music room where no music played, the conservatory where hothouse flowers bloomed for an audience of ghosts. Michelle walked them all, mapping her cage, while somewhere in the East Wing her husband conducted his life as though she did not exist. She passed servants who curtsied and vanished. She stood before ancestral portraits, stern men and elegant women who had presumably married for more than convenience. In the gallery, she found Matthew's father, the late Duke, his face carved from the same unyielding stone as his son's. Below the portrait, a single line, "Here lies duty." Michelle pressed her palm against the cold wall and wondered if she, too, would eventually become just another ghost haunting these halls, another nameless duchess who had learned too late that protection and prison wore the same face. The door to Matthew's study was locked, but Michelle had grown up with brothers. She knew that hairpins could be keys if one possessed sufficient determination and nothing left to lose. The lock yielded on her second attempt, the click loud as a confession in the silent corridor. Inside, amber light filtered through leaded windows onto walls lined with leather-bound volumes and the smell of tobacco and old paper. It was the warmest room she'd encountered at Sterling Park, lived in where everything else felt preserved. His coat draped over a chair. A half-drunk glass of whiskey sat on the desk beside correspondence sealed with red wax. Then she saw the portrait. Elizabeth gazed down from above the mantelpiece with dark eyes full of laughter and conspiracy, painted in a garden somewhere summer-drenched and impossibly far from Sterling Park's Gothic gloom. She wore white muslin and held orange blossoms, caught in a moment of joy so vivid it made Michelle's chest ache. Elizabeth. Lost but not forgotten. You were told this room was private, madam. Michelle spun. Matthew filled the doorway, backlit and terrible, his face carved from winter itself. I needed to understand. You needed nothing but to obey. Yet his eyes betrayed him, flickering to the portrait with something raw and ruined. That is Lady Elizabeth. My cousin. My betrayer. The reason I will never again be fool enough to speak a woman's name with affection. She hurt you, Michelle whispered. She destroyed me. His voice was quiet, more devastating for its control. And you, Duchess, will never be granted the opportunity to do the same. Dinner at Stirling Park was a choreographed silence. They sat at opposite ends of the table, Matthew hidden behind the Times, Michelle occupied with pushing venison around her plate while footmen moved like well-trained shadows. It had been this way for 3 weeks. Until the peacock. It appeared in the formal gardens at twilight, escaped from some neighbor's estate, dragging its ridiculous tail across the manicured lawn with the gravitas of a bishop processing to mass. Michelle, watching from the dining room windows, couldn't contain the laugh that bubbled up, bright, surprised, utterly genuine. The Times lowered. Matthew stared at her as though she'd sprouted wings, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. For the first time since their wedding, he actually looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at the woman whose laughter filled the cavernous room with something dangerously close to life. It thinks rather well of itself, Michelle said, gesturing to the bird now preening near the fountain. For something that sounds like a strangled cat. The corner of Matthew's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but not the granite mask either. My father once tried to roast one. Said it tasted of arrogance and poor decisions. That seems fitting. Silence fell, but different now, not the void between strangers, but the quiet between two people who had accidentally shared something real. Matthew folded his paper with deliberate care. The Duchess has a pleasant laugh, he said finally, the words clearly costing him. It suits the house. Then he left, but Michelle could have sworn she saw him glance back. The book appeared on Michelle's breakfast tray like a question mark. Sense and Sensibility, leather-bound, well-read, its spine cracked from previous hands. No note accompanied it, but she knew. Only one person in Stirling Park possessed a library worth plundering. The next morning brought Waverley. The morning after, a French volume of poetry she'd mentioned once, in passing, to Mrs. Havering while discussing the emptiness of her days. Michelle held it, tracing the gilt letters, understanding with sudden clarity that Matthew had been listening. Not speaking, perhaps, but listening. The books kept coming. Gothic novels that made her gasp. Agricultural treatises that made her laugh, imagining him selecting them with that serious face. A book on Roman architecture. Another on medicinal herbs. Each one a sentence in a conversation he refused to have aloud. She began leaving responses, bookmarks placed at meaningful passages, pressed flowers marking poems about loneliness and hope. Once, daringly, she returned a volume with a note, the heroine deserved better than cold reserve. The next book came with 2 sentences in his precise hand, the hero was a fool. Fools learned slowly. Michelle sat in her window seat, holding those words like kindling, and wondered if a man who gifted books about foolish heroes might someday become wise enough to speak her name. It was a dangerous thought. Hope had teeth. But the books kept coming, and with them, the first fragile threads of something that might, in time, grow strong enough to bridge the distance between them. If this story has captured your interest, please like the video and subscribe for more. The carriage to London trapped them in forced proximity for 6 hours. Matthew sat across from Michelle, ostensibly reading correspondence, actually watching her reflection in the window as countryside blurred past. She had her own book, one of his gifts, but the words swam meaninglessly before her eyes. By hour 4, the silence had teeth. "I cannot do this," Michelle said abruptly, closing her book with enough force to make him look up. "I cannot spend the season pretending to be your wife while you refuse to acknowledge I exist beyond my womb. You knew the terms. Damn the terms." Her voice cracked. "Why? Why can you leave me books but not say my name? Why can you watch me when you think I don't notice but freeze when I enter a room? What am I to you, Matthew, besides a convenient vessel?" She'd used his Christian name deliberately, watching him flinch as though struck. "You wish to know." His words came quiet, dangerous. "Very well. You are a threat, madam. Every kindness you show, every laugh, every moment of grace, they are weapons whether you intend them as such or not. I spoke Elizabeth's name with love. I trusted. I was betrayed so thoroughly it nearly destroyed my house. I am not her. No." He leaned forward, emerald eyes blazing. "You are worse. Because when you inevitably break my trust, Duchess, I will have no legal recourse. You are my wife. You can destroy me from within." Michelle met his gaze, understanding flooding through her. "You're not afraid of being hurt. You're afraid of caring enough to be hurt." The carriage lurched over a rut. Matthew turned back to his correspondence, but his hands trembled. "Yes." Lady Ashworth cornered Michelle at the Pemberton Ball 3 days into the season. She was a handsome woman with cold calculation in her eyes and a history Michelle didn't yet know. Matthew's father had broken an engagement to Lady Ashworth's mother decades ago, and some wounds festered for generations. "My dear Duchess." The smile was poisoned honey. "How brave of you to attend. I confess, I couldn't endure what you do, a husband who cannot bear to speak your name. They say he addresses you only as a madam even in private. Is it true?" Michelle's fingers tightened on her fan. Around them, conversations dimmed as ears pricked toward scandal. "The Duke and I." "Oh, we all know." Lady Ashworth's voice carried beautifully. "A marriage of convenience for a family drowning in debt. But convenience usually includes some pretense of affection, doesn't it? When a man won't speak his wife's name, well, it suggests something rather more than indifference." "Perhaps he fears attachment," Michelle said quietly. "Or perhaps he simply loathes you." The words landed like a blade between ribs. Michelle felt the ballroom's eyes upon her, measuring, judging, finding her wanting. Matthew stood across the room in conversation with Lord Melbourne, oblivious to her unraveling. He hadn't looked at her once since they'd arrived. Lady Ashworth leaned close. "Leave while you still have dignity, girl. He'll never love you. You're a womb with a title, nothing more." Michelle turned and walked, not toward Matthew, but toward the doors, the street, anywhere but this glittering cage where she would always be invisible. Behind her, Lady Ashworth smiled. Matthew had been watching Michelle all evening, the way a man watches something precious placed too near a cliff edge. He saw Lady Ashworth approach. Saw Michelle's spine stiffen. Saw the moment something broke in his wife's eyes. Then she was moving toward the doors, and he understood with sudden, visceral terror that she wasn't coming back. He crossed the ballroom in 10 strides, seized her arm before she reached the exit. Michelle turned, tear tracks silvering her cheeks, and tried to pull free. "Let me go." "No. You don't even want me here. You haven't looked at me once, haven't spoken. Because if I look at you, I see everything I'm terrified of wanting." The words tore from him too loud, too raw. The ballroom fell silent. Matthew barely noticed. "Because every time you laugh, every time you show me kindness I don't deserve, every damned book you return with flowers pressed in pages about hope." She was trying to leave. Actually trying to walk away from him. Panic, white and absolute, clawed through his chest. "Michelle!" Her name erupted from him like something breaking. The sound shattered the careful silence he'd built for 12 years, echoed off the ballroom's gilt ceiling, stopped her dead in her tracks. "Michelle," he said again, quieter but no less desperate. His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing away tears. "Michelle Felix. My wife. Stay. Please. I cannot do this without you. I cannot be this person anymore." The ballroom stared. Matthew didn't care. "Say it again," Michelle whispered. "Michelle. Michelle. Michelle." Each repetition felt like breaking and healing simultaneously. "God help me, Michelle, I love you." 5 months later, Sterling Park had learned to sing. Michelle woke to autumn light streaming through windows deliberately left uncurtained, and Matthew's hand resting protective over the swell of her belly where their child grew. He was already awake, as he often was these days, watching her with an expression that still surprised her with its unguarded tenderness. "Michelle." He said it like prayer, like coming home. "How do you feel this morning?" "Like I've swallowed a melon." She smiled, covering his hand with hers. "A very active melon." He laughed, that sound she'd excavated from beneath 12 years of silence, now offered freely as sunrise. They had transformed Sterling Park room by room, replacing ghosts with life. The music room hosted concerts now. The ballroom would host Christmas. The portrait of Elizabeth remained in Matthew's study, but no longer as a shrine to betrayal, merely memory of a woman who had made terrible choices and paid terribly for them. Forgiveness, Matthew had learned, did not require forgetting. "I've been thinking," he said, tracing patterns on her belly. "If it's a girl, perhaps we might name her Grace. Or Charlotte. Something that means kindness. And if it's a boy, Thomas. After your father, who had the wisdom to sell you to a fool who didn't deserve you." Michelle caught his face between her hands. "You are many things, Matthew George. A fool is no longer one of them." He kissed her then, deep and sure, before pressing his lips to her stomach and whispering the child's first lesson, "Your mother's name is Michelle. Never forget it." "I nearly did, and it almost cost me everything." Outside, morning broke over Sterling Park with the sound of life returning to stone halls that had been silent far too long. If this tale has stirred your curiosity, a simple like and subscription is most appreciated. And if you wish, share in the comments where you are listening from. Thank you.